Step back. Hands where I can see them. The voice cut through the air like a blade. It wasn't a request, it was a command. He froze, his breath catching as the officer's hand hovered near his holster. People around the park paused, their eyes darting between the scene and their phones, already recording. The man's pulse thundered in his ears. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had just been running, clearing his mind after a long week. But now, he stood under the weight of suspicion, of assumptions, of prejudice. "What's the problem, officer?" His voice was steady, but inside, something cracked. He had faced pressure before, but not like this. Not with so many eyes watching. "Don't move." The officer's voice rose, sharp and biting. "You match the description of a suspect, dark skin, athletic build. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The words cut deeper than he expected. Dark skin. Athletic build. That's all it took to make him a target. The man opened his mouth to protest, but the officer closed the gap between them in seconds, shoving him hard enough to make him stumble. "Turn around and get on the ground." Confusion flared into anger. He raised his hands higher, resisting the urge to push back, to demand answers. "This is a mistake. I'm not who you think I am." "Shut up." The officer's hands were already on his shoulders, forcing him down. "You people always think you're above the rules. Not today. You people." Those words stung like a slap. His knees hit the dirt, his palms scraping against gravel. A crowd gathered now, their murmurs like static in the background. Some whispered. Others shouted for the officer to stop. But no one stepped in. His breathing quickened as the officer yanked his arms behind his back, metal cuffs biting into his wrists. "You're under arrest," the officer hissed, pulling him to his feet as if he were nothing more than a criminal trying to run. "For what?" he demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Resisting arrest and suspicion of theft." The man blinked. Theft. He'd been jogging. He hadn't touched anything, hadn't even spoken to anyone. But none of that mattered, not to the officer. "You don't even know who I am," the man said through clenched teeth. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," the officer spat. "Just another thug who thinks the rules don't apply." The crowd grew louder, cameras flashing as the officer shoved him toward the squad car. The man tried to keep his head high, but the weight of humiliation dragged him down. Every step felt heavier. Every glance burned into his skin. But what the officer didn't know, what no one there could have guessed, was that this so-called thug wasn't just anybody. He was a decorated officer himself. A leader. A protector. A captain in the United States Navy. And as the squad car's door slammed shut behind him, something inside him shifted. He wasn't going to let this end here. Not like this. The headlines would soon explode. The cameras would capture more than just the arrest. But the real story, the one that no one saw coming, was what would happen next. The tables were about to turn, and the man who had been humiliated and treated like less than human was about to show everyone exactly who he was. But the question remained, how far would he go to make sure justice was served? And when the truth came out, would the officer be ready to face the consequences of his actions? Or would he be crushed under the weight of his own mistakes? One thing was certain, this wasn't just a story about injustice. It was a story about power, redemption, and the kind of reckoning that no one could ignore. And by the time it was over, no one, especially not the officer, would ever forget what happened in that park. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. We believe in equality, respect, and the power of stories to inspire change. If you've ever faced prejudice or felt the sting of unfair treatment, know that you are seen, valued, and supported here. This story is more than fiction, it's a reflection of the struggles many have faced and a reminder that justice and dignity will always prevail. Sit back, enjoy the twists, and get ready for a powerful journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our mission of telling impactful stories. Now, let's dive into today's story. Enjoy! The early morning sun stretched lazily across Oakwood Park, bathing the jogging trails in golden light. Birds chirped in the branches of the old oaks, their melodies blending with the faint hum of distant traffic. The park, a peaceful slice of greenery nestled in the suburbs, was alive with movement, mothers pushing strollers, elderly couples walking hand in hand, and joggers pounding the trails in rhythm with their breath. Among them was Marcus Reed, his stride strong and measured, each footfall a release of tension he didn't even realize he carried. Marcus had always found comfort in routine. The Navy had drilled discipline into him, but even before that, he thrived on structure. His morning runs weren't just exercise, they were clarity, a way to steady himself before facing the unpredictable demands of leadership. At 42, Marcus exuded quiet confidence. Broad shoulders, a chiseled jaw, and sharp, focused eyes, everything about him projected strength. Yet, his strength wasn't just physical. It was in the way he carried himself, with a kind of unspoken authority that didn't need to be announced. Despite his achievements, Marcus never flaunted them. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood had taught him humility. His parents, both schoolteachers, had emphasized hard work and integrity over everything else. Marcus had carried those values with him, even when life tested him in ways he never saw coming. His journey to becoming a Navy captain wasn't easy. He had faced challenges that went beyond the physical demands of training, subtle slights, doubting glances, and outright discrimination. Yet, he never let any of it stop him. Instead, he had risen, step by step, until he earned the respect of his peers and the admiration of his subordinates. But respect was fragile, and Marcus knew how quickly it could be stripped away, especially when people chose to see only the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. He pushed those thoughts aside as his feet hit the pavement. Today wasn't about the past. It was about focus, about staying grounded. But as he turned the corner near the playground, his pulse quickened, not from exertion but from the sight ahead. A patrol car idled near the park's entrance. Marcus noticed it earlier but hadn't paid it much mind. Now, though, the officer inside was watching him. No, more than watching. Studying him. Marcus felt the weight of that gaze settle on his back, heavy and deliberate. He slowed his pace, pulling the earbuds from his ears. He didn't want to seem threatening. Years of experience had taught him how to diffuse tension before it escalated. Still, he hoped it wouldn't come to that. He just wanted to finish his run. Officer Ryan Caldwell stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his holster. He was young, mid-30s maybe, with the sharp features and close-cropped hair that screamed authority. But there was something else, something harder to define. An edge. Ryan had grown up in Oakwood. He knew every street, every alley, and every face that belonged here. At least, he thought he did. His father had been a cop before him, and his older brother had joined the force straight out of high school. Law enforcement wasn't just a career in the Caldwell family, it was a legacy. A badge meant power, and Ryan had worn his like armor since the day he pinned it to his chest. But Ryan carried shadows. Anger, frustration, and a bitterness he rarely admitted, even to himself. He had seen the city change, seen neighborhoods that once felt safe start to shift. And with those changes came faces he didn't trust, faces like the man running in the park now. Marcus noticed Ryan's approach immediately, but he didn't stop. Not until Ryan barked the first command. Stop right there. Marcus turned slowly, keeping his hands visible. He knew the drill. Too many men who looked like him didn't get second chances when things went wrong. Is there a problem, officer? His voice was calm, steady, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Ryan's eyes swept over him, taking in the athletic gear, the expensive running shoes, the watch that looked too costly for a man out jogging. ID, now. Marcus hesitated. I don't carry ID when I run. Ryan's expression hardened. What are you doing here? Marcus gestured toward the trail behind him. Jogging. Is that a crime? Ryan's jaw tightened. We've had reports of break-ins around here. You match the description. Marcus's stomach dropped. He knew exactly what that meant, but he forced himself to stay composed. I don't think I do. Hands where I can see them. Officer, now. The moment Ryan reached for his cuffs, Marcus's heart pounded. He could already feel the stares. The whispers. The judgment. And the humiliation burned hotter than the morning sun. Ryan didn't care who he was, not really. To Ryan, Marcus was a suspect first, a threat second, and a man not at all. The cuffs snapped around Marcus's wrists, sharp and cold. His mind raced. He wanted to shout, to resist, to force Ryan to look at him and see the truth. But he didn't. Because Marcus knew this wasn't the moment to fight. Not yet. As Ryan shoved him toward the patrol car, Marcus met the eyes of the crowd forming around them. Phones were out, cameras recording. The footage would spread, but Marcus wasn't sure if that would help or hurt him. He kept his head up, even as shame gnawed at him. He had survived worse. He would survive this too. But the wheels were already turning. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when the truth came out, when Marcus finally revealed who he was, the fallout would be explosive. The only question left was whether Ryan would be ready to face it. Marcus sat stiffly in the back of the squad car, his wrists aching from the unforgiving grip of the handcuffs. The hard metal pressed against his skin, leaving red indentations that he knew would linger long after this moment passed. The car's interior smelled faintly of sweat and stale coffee, but it wasn't the discomfort or the smell that weighed on him, it was the stares. Through the tinted glass, he could see silhouettes outside. People had gathered, their shapes distorted by the reflection on the windows, but Marcus didn't need to see their faces to know what they were thinking. The murmurs, the phones held high to capture the scene, the whispers of judgment, all of it sank into him like a heavy stone. His breathing was steady, but his mind raced. The engine thrummed beneath him, vibrating through his bones as Officer Ryan Caldwell sat in the front seat, flipping casually through a notepad like he had just wrapped up another routine arrest. But this wasn't routine. Not for Marcus. Not for a man who had spent his entire life serving his country, protecting the very freedom that had just been stripped from him in a single humiliating moment. Ryan finally broke the silence, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. You think you're some kind of victim, huh? He didn't turn around as he spoke, keeping his focus on the road ahead as though Marcus's presence barely registered. Marcus didn't answer. He kept his gaze fixed on the back of Ryan's head, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Ryan smirked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. I've seen your type before. Fancy running shoes, expensive watch. Walking around acting like you own the place, thinking the rules don't apply to you. Marcus's eyes met Ryan's in the mirror, unflinching. And what type is that, exactly? Ryan's voice hardened. The kind that doesn't belong here, the kind that thinks they can blend in but never really do. Marcus felt the words like a slap, sharp and personal. He forced himself to stay calm, his shoulders squared even as his wrists throbbed against the cuffs. He leaned slightly forward, his voice steady but laced with tension. You don't know anything about me. Ryan smirked, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the steering wheel. I know enough. Enough to see through the act. Marcus exhaled slowly, measuring his words. You're making a mistake. Ryan finally turned his head, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of defiance and arrogance. The only mistake I made was wasting time talking to you. Marcus sat back, letting the silence stretch. He'd dealt with men like Ryan before, men who wore their authority like armor, mistaking it for strength. But something about Ryan was different. There was an edge to him, a simmering anger that Marcus couldn't quite place. It wasn't just about control. It was personal. The drive to the station felt endless. Marcus counted the turns, memorized the route, not because he planned to resist but because routine calmed him. It reminded him who he was, who he still was, despite the circumstances. The streets blurred past, and when the car finally pulled up to the station, Marcus braced himself. Ryan stepped out first, slamming the door behind him. A second later, he opened Marcus's door and gestured for him to step out. The cuffs bit deeper as Marcus moved, the weight of humiliation heavier with every step. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, sterile and unwelcoming. The hum of conversations filled the air, officers talking, phones ringing, footsteps echoing against the tile floor. Ryan's grip on Marcus's arm tightened as he led him to the booking desk. The officer behind the counter barely looked up, already filling out forms. "What's the charge?" "Suspicion of theft and resisting arrest," Ryan said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Marcus's jaw clenched. He wanted to correct him, to demand justice, but he bit his tongue. This wasn't the moment. "Name?" the officer asked without looking up. Marcus hesitated for the briefest second, then answered. The officer typed it in, pausing just long enough for his fingers to hover over the keys. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, but it was gone just as quickly. "Any weapons on you?" "No." "Drugs?" "No." The officer's eyes darted toward Ryan, as if to check for confirmation, then continued. "Priors?" Marcus met his gaze. "None." Ryan stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. "You sure about that?" Marcus didn't flinch. "Look me up." Ryan's smirk faltered, just slightly, but he recovered quickly. "We'll see." The booking process dragged on, each step another blow to Marcus's dignity. Photos, fingerprints, and endless questions, most of them designed to provoke rather than inform. Ryan stayed close, watching, waiting for Marcus to crack, but he didn't. Finally, Marcus was led to a holding cell. The metal door closed behind him with a heavy clang, leaving him alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of distant voices. He sat on the bench, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. The anger simmered beneath the surface, but he refused to let it consume him. Minutes stretched into hours. Marcus's thoughts raced, strategies, explanations, outcomes. He thought of his crew, the men and women who trusted him, who saw him as a leader. What would they think if they saw him now? He shook the thought away. This wasn't about shame. It was about survival. The sound of footsteps broke his focus. Ryan appeared at the bars, his smirk firmly back in place. "Comfortable?" Marcus didn't look up. "You're going to regret this." Ryan's smirk deepened. Big words for a guy in cuffs. Marcus finally met his eyes, his voice calm but loaded with meaning. "You have no idea who I am." For the first time, Ryan hesitated. It was subtle, the briefest flicker of uncertainty, but Marcus saw it. Ryan straightened, trying to regain control. "Doesn't matter who you are. Right now, you're just another suspect." Marcus leaned back, his confidence returning as he watched Ryan struggle to maintain his composure. "We'll see." Ryan stepped away, but Marcus knew he wasn't finished. Not yet. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, the tension building with every passing second. Marcus could feel the shift, the slow unraveling of Ryan's confidence. And when the truth came out, when Marcus revealed exactly who he was, everything would change. Marcus's pulse quickened, not from fear but from anticipation. He had been patient, but patience had its limits. The pieces were already moving, and soon, Ryan would have no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. As the sound of Ryan's footsteps faded, Marcus leaned back against the cold wall of the cell. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over. Not even close. And when the truth finally broke through the lies, the fallout would be unstoppable. The steady clink of Ryan Caldwell's boots echoed sharply off the narrow, dimly lit corridor as he approached the holding cell where Marcus Reed sat, still bound in cuffs that dug into his skin. Marcus sat upright on the metal bench bolted to the wall, his posture rigid but calm, his shoulders squared as though the weight of the situation couldn't touch him. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows against the concrete walls. The air smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant, and the low murmur of voices from the other side of the building seemed distant, muffled by the tension that filled the room like a fog. Ryan stopped just outside the cell door, keys jangling in his hand as he leaned casually against the bars, trying to maintain the appearance of control. His smirk was tight, forced, like someone holding onto a rope that was slipping through their fingers. He tapped the keys against the metal, his eyes locked on Marcus, waiting for a reaction that never came. "Time's up," Ryan said finally, his voice sharp but quieter than before, almost like he was testing the waters. Marcus didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch long enough for Ryan's confidence to waver, just slightly. Then, slowly, he lifted his eyes to meet the officer's gaze. His stare was steady, deliberate, and unshaken. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ryan shifted his weight but tried to mask his discomfort with bravado. "It means your little act is over. Whatever game you thought you were playing, it's done. Nobody's coming to save you." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You sure about that?" His voice was low, even, but there was something in it, an edge that made Ryan's smirk falter for the briefest moment before snapping back into place. Ryan crossed his arms, his posture defensive. "I ran your name through the system. Nothing special came up. Just another guy trying to talk his way out of trouble." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Then maybe you didn't look hard enough." Ryan's face hardened, but the crack in his confidence was there now, faint but visible. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I don't care who you think you are. Out there, people like you don't get special treatment. Not from me." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but cutting. "People like me? What exactly does that mean, Officer Caldwell?" Ryan hesitated, and for the first time, his confidence wavered. But before he could respond, the door at the far end of the hall burst open with enough force to make both men turn. The older officer from earlier, the one who had interrupted during booking, rushed in, his face pale and tight with urgency. "Caldwell, you need to come with me. Now." Ryan frowned but didn't move. "I'm in the middle of something." "No," the officer snapped, stepping closer. "You need to come with me immediately." Ryan hesitated, glancing back at Marcus, who had leaned back again, his expression unreadable but steady. The tension in the room grew thicker as Ryan finally turned and followed the other officer down the hall, his footsteps sharp and uneven. Marcus stayed seated, listening. The hum of voices outside the cell grew louder. The words were still muffled, but the tone was clear, urgent, tense, uncertain. He heard Ryan's voice rise, indignant, demanding answers, and then another voice, lower and more authoritative, cutting him off. Minutes passed. Marcus remained still, his mind sharp and focused, every muscle in his body bracing for what was coming. Then the door at the end of the hall opened again, and this time it wasn't Ryan who stepped inside. It was the station chief. The chief's presence filled the room immediately. He was tall and broad, his graying beard and no-nonsense demeanor radiating authority. He didn't waste time, striding straight to the cell and unlocking the door with a quick motion. "Captain Reed," the chief said, his voice firm but respectful. Marcus rose slowly, his eyes locked on the chief. "Chief." Ryan appeared in the doorway just in time to see the cuffs being removed. His face went pale, his mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but no words came out. "What's going on?" Ryan finally managed to choke out. The chief didn't look at him. We verified his identity. This is Captain Marcus Reed. United States Navy. Ryan's eyes widened, his face draining of color. That's not possible. I ran his name. He's lying. He's not lying, the chief snapped, cutting him off. We confirmed it. Captain Reed is exactly who he says he is, and you just made one hell of a mistake. Ryan took a step back, his eyes darting between Marcus and the chief, disbelief etched across his face. But, he didn't say anything. He didn't tell me. Marcus turned toward him, his voice sharp but calm. I didn't have to. You should have done your job instead of making assumptions. Ryan's face burned red, his mouth opening like he wanted to argue, but the chief cut him off again. My office. Now. Ryan's shoulders stiffened, but he obeyed, walking out of the room with quick, angry steps. Marcus watched him go, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of everything he had endured. The chief turned back to Marcus. I'm sorry this happened, Captain. We'll handle it. Marcus nodded but didn't let his guard down. See that you do. He stepped out of the cell and into the hallway, his head held high despite the stares that followed him. But the looks were different now, uncertain, uneasy, and, in some cases, ashamed. The station buzzed with tension, officers whispering to one another as the weight of the situation began to sink in. From behind the closed door of the chief's office, Ryan's voice erupted, sharp and desperate. Marcus didn't stop walking. He didn't need to hear the details to know what was happening inside. The cracks in Ryan's armor had finally given way, and the fallout was beginning. Marcus paused at the exit, turning just enough to let the weight of the moment settle in. He had faced battles before, on land, at sea, and now here, in a small police station where prejudice had tried to strip him of his dignity. But he had survived. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as Marcus stepped out into the daylight, he knew one thing, the reckoning had only just begun. Marcus stood just outside the station's front doors, the sunlight sharp against his face. He took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling as the tension in his shoulders lingered. The noise inside the station hummed faintly through the glass, but he could still hear it, the murmurs, the rapid footsteps, and Ryan's voice echoing from the chief's office, rising and falling in bursts of desperation. Marcus didn't turn back. He kept his posture steady, his movements deliberate, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface, pressing against his ribs like a vice. The door behind him creaked open, and Marcus didn't need to look to know who it was. Ryan's footsteps were heavier than before, faster, less controlled. He stormed out, his face flushed, eyes darting wildly as though searching for an explanation he couldn't find. Marcus finally turned to face him, his expression calm but unyielding. Ryan's jaw tightened. You think this is over? Ryan's voice cracked slightly, but he tried to mask it with anger. You think you can just walk out of here like none of this happened? Marcus stared at him, unblinking. No, he said, his voice even. I don't think it's over. But you need to understand something, Officer Caldwell, what happens next isn't up to you anymore. Ryan took a step closer, his shoulders squared, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Don't act like you're some kind of hero. You think just because you've got a title, you're untouchable. You're not. You're just another guy who got lucky today. Marcus's voice sharpened. Lucky? You think this is luck? You think being dragged out of a park in handcuffs, treated like a criminal in front of strangers, humiliated and disrespected, that's luck? He stepped closer, his voice rising, but still controlled. You don't get to decide what I am. Not anymore. Ryan's face reddened further, but his words faltered. I was doing my job. No, Marcus snapped, his tone cutting. You were feeding your ego. You saw what you wanted to see. You thought you had me figured out the second you laid eyes on me. You didn't see a man. You didn't see a veteran. You didn't see someone who spent his life protecting people like you. All you saw was a threat. Ryan's mouth opened, but no words came out. He shifted his weight, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Marcus took another step, his voice steady but heavy. And you know what? That's the real problem. It's not the badge. It's not the uniform. It's you. You let your fear and your prejudice make decisions for you, and now you're the one who has to live with that. Ryan shook his head, his voice cracking. You don't understand. Marcus's eyes darkened. No. You don't understand. I've seen men like you before. Men who think authority gives them the right to treat people however they want. But it doesn't. That badge isn't power, it's responsibility. And today, you failed it. Ryan's face twisted, his voice dropping. You think you're better than me? Is that it? Because you've got a title? Because you wear a different uniform? You don't know what it's like out here, what it's like to always be on edge, to never know who you can trust. Marcus's voice softened, but the weight of it didn't lift. You're right. I don't know what it's like to wear your uniform. But I know what it's like to lead. I know what it's like to have men trust me with their lives and to feel the weight of that responsibility every single day. And I know what it means to carry that responsibility with honor. Do you? Ryan faltered, his shoulders dropping slightly, but the anger in his eyes flared again as he tried to recover. This isn't about me. Marcus took another step, his voice lowering but cutting even deeper. It is about you. It's about the choices you made, the assumptions, the anger, the power you abused. And now, everyone's going to see it. This moment, this mistake, it's not going away. The cameras were rolling. The people were watching. And the truth is coming out whether you're ready for it or not. Ryan's breathing quickened. You're trying to ruin me. No, Marcus said, his tone sharp but measured. You did that yourself. The door to the station opened again, and the chief stepped out. His expression was stern, his eyes hard as they shifted from Marcus to Ryan. Caldwell, the chief said, his voice loud and firm. Inside. Now. Ryan froze for a moment, but then his shoulders sagged as the command sank in. He turned back to Marcus, his expression torn between anger and something closer to fear. Marcus didn't flinch. He watched Ryan walk back inside, the door closing heavily behind him. The chief lingered for a moment, his voice quieter now. We'll make this right, the chief said. You have my word. Marcus met his eyes, nodding slightly. See that you do. The chief gave a brief nod and disappeared back into the building, leaving Marcus alone in the sunlight. He stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of the past few hours settle before finally stepping away from the station. He didn't know what would happen next, how far the fallout would spread, how deeply it would cut, but he knew this wasn't the end. Not for him. Not for Ryan. Not for the conversations that were just beginning. And as Marcus walked away, his shoulders straight and his head held high, he carried with him the weight of the moment, and the determination to make sure no one else would have to bear it the way he had. Marcus stood outside the station, his shadow stretching long across the pavement as the late afternoon sun dipped lower. The air was heavy, not just with heat but with the weight of everything that had unfolded. His shoulders were squared, his breathing steady, but his mind churned. The echoes of Ryan's voice still lingered in his ears, defiant, desperate, and cracking under the strain of a reality he hadn't been prepared to face. Marcus knew that what had happened wasn't just a confrontation between two men. It was something deeper, more raw, a reflection of fractures that ran through the very foundation of the world they lived in. Behind him, the station doors swung open again. Marcus didn't turn, but he could feel the presence of someone stepping out. The footsteps slowed as they approached, cautious but deliberate. It was the chief. His voice carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Captain Reed. Marcus finally turned to face him, his expression calm but unyielding. "We've taken Officer Caldwell off duty," the chief said, his tone even but heavy. "Pending an investigation." Marcus studied the man's face, searching for sincerity and finding it, though it was buried under layers of weariness. "Investigations don't always lead to accountability," Marcus said, his voice measured. The chief's gaze didn't waver. "This one will. I'll make sure of it." Marcus crossed his arms, his voice quieter but no less pointed. "I've seen too many promises like that get buried under paperwork. What makes this time different?" The chief exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Because this isn't just about Caldwell anymore. It's about us. The whole department. What happened today doesn't go away just because we want it to. It's already out there. And the truth is, we can't afford to let this slide. Not this time." Marcus let the word settle, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. "You should have seen it before it got to this point." The chief nodded, the weight of agreement evident in his eyes. "You're right. We should have." Marcus's voice sharpened. "But you didn't. And now, people are watching. Not just me. Everyone. What you do next, what this department does next, is going to matter." The chief's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "We'll do what's right. Even if it costs us." Marcus didn't look away. "Make sure it does." The chief stepped back, giving Marcus a nod before walking away, but Marcus didn't move. He stayed rooted in place, his mind shifting through the pieces of the day, the arrest, the confrontation, the look in Ryan's eyes as everything unraveled. There had been anger, of course, but beneath it, Marcus had seen something else. Fear. Not fear of Marcus, but fear of exposure, of being stripped bare and forced to see himself for what he truly was. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes scanning the street, catching glimpses of people watching from a distance. Some with curiosity. Others with quiet approval. And some with judgment, their stares sharp and unrelenting. He ignored them, moving with purpose toward his car, but before he reached it, a voice stopped him. "Captain Reed." Marcus turned to see a woman stepping toward him, a reporter clutching a notepad and a phone. She looked determined, her eyes sharp and her steps quick. "Can I get a comment about what happened today?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he stayed composed. "No comment." She didn't back down. "The video's already viral. People want to know what happens next. They want to know what this means, for you and for him." Marcus studied her for a moment, then exhaled. "What it means is that this can't keep happening. Not here. Not anywhere." The reporter's pen hovered over the notepad. "And Officer Caldwell? What do you think should happen to him?" Marcus's eyes darkened. "That's not for me to decide. It's for the system he swore to protect. But what happens next will show the world whether that system is broken, or whether it can actually deliver justice." The reporter nodded quickly, her pen scratching across the paper. "Do you think this will change anything?" Marcus's voice steadied. "I think it has to." The reporter stepped back, but Marcus could feel the weight of her words lingering as he climbed into his car. The interior felt cool and quiet, but the silence didn't bring comfort. It brought reflection. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles tightening as he replayed the events in his mind. The look in Ryan's eyes, the crack in his voice, the way his hands had twitched as though he wanted to hold on to control even as it slipped away. Marcus didn't know what would happen to Ryan, whether he would be fired, charged, or quietly transferred to another department, but he knew this wasn't just about Ryan anymore. It wasn't just about one man's mistake or one moment of humiliation. It was about what came after. The fallout was already spreading. Marcus could feel it. The weight of the video, the conversations it was sparking, the outrage it was fueling. But even as the anger burned, Marcus couldn't ignore the other side of it, the questions. The doubt. The voices asking whether one bad cop meant all of them were bad, whether accountability was enough, whether forgiveness had any place in justice. And that was the dilemma Marcus couldn't escape. He had seen the cracks in Ryan's armor, the fear that had broken through his anger. He had watched the man crumble under the weight of his own actions, and part of him wondered if that was punishment enough. But another part, the part that remembered the humiliation, the fear, the way Ryan's hands had forced him down as though he were nothing, knew it wasn't. Marcus's grip on the wheel loosened slightly as the weight of the questions settled deeper. Justice wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. And the path forward was anything but clear. As he started the engine, the hum of the car felt distant, almost muted, against the storm that was still raging in his mind. The fight wasn't over. The questions weren't answered. And Marcus knew the hardest part was still ahead. Marcus sat in his car, the engine humming softly as the weight of the day settled over him like a storm cloud that refused to break. His fingers drummed lightly against the steering wheel, his mind racing through every moment, Ryan's voice, sharp and defensive, the chief's words promising accountability, the reporter's questions that still echoed in his head. His pulse slowed, but the tension lingered, tight and unyielding. He reached for his phone, hesitating for a moment before unlocking it. The notifications flooded in, missed calls, text messages, and countless links to the video that had already gone viral. He hesitated before pressing play, the shaky footage capturing his arrest from multiple angles. The voices in the background buzzed with shock and disbelief, but Marcus focused on his own image, his arms locked behind his back, his face calm but burning with humiliation. He paused the video, his reflection staring back at him from the screen, and for the first time, he let the anger rise just enough to feel it fully. The knock on the window snapped him back. He turned to see the chief standing outside, his expression tense but composed. Marcus lowered the window slowly, his voice steady. "Chief." The chief leaned in slightly, his voice low. "I thought you'd be gone by now." Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. I needed a minute." The chief glanced at the phone in Marcus's hand, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I saw it too. It's bad." Marcus's eyes didn't leave the chief's. "It's the truth." The chief exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I don't disagree, but this is going to get messy. The calls are already coming in. Internal affairs is involved, and the mayor's office wants answers." Marcus leaned back, his voice sharp but calm. "Then give them answers. The right ones." The chief's eyes narrowed. "You think I don't want that? You think I don't know how bad this looks? This department's reputation is already hanging by a thread, and this could tear it apart." Marcus's voice didn't waver. "Maybe it should be torn apart. Maybe it needs to be if that's what it takes to fix it." The chief shook his head but didn't argue. Instead, he straightened, glancing back toward the station. "Caldwell's still inside. He's not handling this well." Marcus's eyes darkened. "I'm not concerned about how he's handling it. I'm concerned about how everyone else is going to handle it when they see what happened. He made his choices. Now he has to live with them." The chief hesitated, his voice quieter. "You saw him. You saw the way he fell apart. That wasn't just guilt. It was fear." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Fear doesn't excuse what he did." The chief nodded slowly. "I know. But it complicates it." Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "You want complicated? Try explaining to my family why their son, their brother, their husband, the man they thought was untouchable, was dragged through the dirt like a common criminal. Try explaining to every person who's ever faced this kind of treatment why they should believe you when you say it won't happen again." The chief didn't respond right away. He just stood there, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. Finally, he stepped back, his voice firm but quieter. "You're right. None of this is simple. But we're going to have to figure it out. Marcus watched him walk back toward the station, the door closing heavily behind him. He sat there for another long moment, the phone still in his hand, before finally setting it down and starting the engine. Later that evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, his eyes scanning the emails and messages flooding his inbox. His phone vibrated again, and he glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. He let it ring twice before answering, his voice sharp but steady. Marcus Reed. There was a pause on the other end, then a voice he recognized immediately. It was Ryan. Marcus's grip tightened around the phone. How did you get this number? Ryan's voice was quieter than before, almost hollow. I looked it up. I needed to talk. Marcus leaned back, his voice firm. About what? Ryan hesitated, and Marcus could hear the tension in his breathing. I messed up. I know I did. But you don't understand, I wasn't trying to. Marcus cut him off, his voice sharp. You weren't trying to what? Humiliate me? Make me feel small? Because that's exactly what you did. Ryan's voice cracked. I didn't think. I reacted. I saw. Marcus's voice rose. You saw what you wanted to see. You didn't see me. You saw what you've been trained to fear. There was silence on the line, and when Ryan spoke again, his voice was unsteady. I know. And I can't take it back. But you have to believe me, I'm not that person. Marcus's voice softened, but the anger didn't fade. You are that person. That's the problem. You think you're not, but you are. And until you face that, nothing changes. Ryan didn't respond right away, and Marcus could hear him struggling for words. I don't know how to fix this. Marcus's voice steadied. Then start by listening. Start by seeing people for who they are, not who you think they are. And start by taking responsibility for what you did. Ryan's breathing steadied slightly, but the weight of the conversation lingered. I want to make this right. Marcus exhaled. Then prove it. Ryan didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He just said, I will, before the line went dead. Marcus set the phone down, his hands resting on the table as the weight of everything settled back onto his shoulders. He didn't know if Ryan would follow through, if he would take the steps needed to make things right, but Marcus knew one thing, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Marcus stood in the dimly lit kitchen, his eyes fixed on the reflection of the overhead light against the darkened window. The night outside seemed still, but his thoughts churned relentlessly, circling back to the same moments over and over again. The sharp clang of the cell door closing behind him. The weight of Ryan's hand pressing him down. The humiliation that had burned hot in his chest as strangers watched and judged without knowing anything about him. The sound of Ryan's voice on the phone, raw and unsteady, pleading for something Marcus wasn't sure he had the strength to give. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easy, not when the wounds were still fresh, still raw. He leaned against the counter, his fingers gripping the edge as if holding on could keep him grounded, but the weight of the day hung over him, heavy and unrelenting. The knock at the door broke through his thoughts, sharp and deliberate. He didn't move at first, letting the sound echo through the room. When it came again, harder this time, he pushed himself away from the counter and crossed the room, his steps slow and deliberate. When he opened the door, he wasn't surprised to see Ryan standing there, but the sight of him still stirred something deep in Marcus's chest. Ryan's shoulders were hunched, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket, and his eyes shifted nervously, unable to settle. He looked smaller than he had earlier, as if the weight of the day had pressed down on him, shrinking him into someone Marcus barely recognized. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, the silence stretching between them like a chasm that neither was sure how to cross. Finally, Marcus broke it, his voice low and steady. What are you doing here? Ryan swallowed hard, his voice quieter than Marcus had ever heard it. I didn't know where else to go. Marcus's grip on the door tightened. You shouldn't be here. Ryan nodded quickly, his eyes darting to the ground. I know. I couldn't leave it like this. Not without talking to you. Not without trying to make it right. Marcus stepped back just enough to let the door hang open, his voice sharp but measured. 5 minutes. That's all you get. Ryan stepped inside cautiously, his movements stiff and uncertain, like a man walking into a room filled with broken glass. He stood just inside the doorway, his hands still shoved deep in his pockets, as if letting them out might make him look weaker than he already felt. Marcus leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he waited. Ryan's voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. I can't stop thinking about it. About everything I did. About what it must have felt like for you to stand there in front of all those people with cuffs on, knowing you hadn't done anything wrong. Marcus's voice came out cold. You should think about it. You should let it keep you up at night. Ryan flinched but didn't look away. I do. I haven't slept since it happened. I keep seeing it, replaying it in my head, and every time, it just feels worse. Marcus's eyes hardened. Good. Maybe now you'll understand what it's like to live with the weight of someone else's judgment. Ryan nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. I wasn't prepared for this. I thought I knew what it meant to wear the badge, to protect people, but today, I saw myself through your eyes, and I hated what I saw. Marcus stepped closer, his voice sharper now. You didn't see yourself through my eyes. You saw yourself for what you really are. And that scared you. Ryan's voice broke. It did scare me. It still does. And I know nothing I say can fix what I did or how it made you feel. But I can't walk away without at least trying to make it right. Marcus's tone didn't soften. What do you want from me? Forgiveness? Redemption? A way to ease your guilt so you can sleep at night? Ryan shook his head, his voice cracking. I want to change. I need to change. But I don't know how to start. Marcus's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. You don't get to ask me how to fix this. That's not my job. You made this mess. Now it's up to you to clean it up. Ryan's shoulders sagged further, but his voice steadied just enough to keep going. I'm trying. But I don't know if it's enough. Marcus's tone grew heavier. It's not enough. Not yet. Words aren't enough. Apologies aren't enough. What matters is what you do next, whether you let this break you or whether you stand up and prove you're better than the man you were today. Ryan's voice dropped, barely more than a whisper. I don't even know where to start. Marcus stepped even closer, his presence looming now. You start by listening. By shutting up and listening to the people you've ignored, the people you've hurt. You start by doing the work, real work, not just saying the right things to make yourself feel better. And you start by letting go of the idea that this is about you, because it's not. It never was. Ryan swallowed hard, his breathing uneven. I need help. Marcus's voice finally softened, but it didn't lose its weight. Then you'd better be ready to fight for it. This isn't going to be easy. Ryan's voice cracked again. I don't care if it's easy. I just care if it's real. Marcus stepped back slightly, his arms dropping to his sides as the tension in his shoulders eased just enough to let the moment breathe. He studied Ryan, looking for cracks, for signs of truth beneath the fear and guilt. He didn't know if he saw what he needed to see, but he knew this much: Ryan wasn't the same man who had shoved him into the dirt hours ago. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. I can't promise to trust you. Not yet. But if you're serious, you'll show me. Not with words. With actions. Ryan nodded, his voice steadier now. I will. Marcus opened the door, gesturing for him to leave. Ryan hesitated for just a moment before stepping outside. He turned back, his voice quieter. "Thank you, for not slamming the door in my face." Marcus didn't respond. He just watched as Ryan walked away, his shoulders slumped but his steps more deliberate than before. As the door closed, Marcus leaned against it, letting out a slow breath. The fight wasn't over. The questions weren't answered. But for the first time, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that could be rebuilt. Marcus stood at the edge of the dock, the calm waters stretching endlessly before him. The rhythmic lapping of waves against the wooden planks mirrored the steadiness he felt within himself for the first time in days. The air carried a salty breeze that cooled his skin, but it wasn't the wind that eased the tension in his chest, it was the clarity that had come after the storm. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the weight of recent events settle into something quieter, something he could finally hold without it burning. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something inside him had shifted. The confrontation, the anger, the humiliation, they were no longer chains around his spirit. They were fuel. He opened his eyes as footsteps approached from behind. Turning, he saw Ryan standing at a distance, his shoulders squared but his expression uncertain. Marcus didn't speak at first. He waited, letting Ryan close the distance on his own. When Ryan finally stopped a few feet away, his eyes never left Marcus's, and for the first time, they didn't hold defiance. They held acceptance. Ryan's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with his demons and lost before finding the courage to face them again. "I wanted to tell you in person. I resigned. Internal affairs gave me the option to fight it, but I knew it wouldn't change what happened. It wouldn't change what I did." Marcus studied him carefully, searching for any trace of resentment or anger, but all he saw was exhaustion mixed with something that looked like determination. Marcus crossed his arms, his voice calm but pointed. "So that's it? You walk away and expect everything to go back to normal?" Ryan shook his head. "No. Nothing goes back to normal. Not for me, not for you, and not for anyone who saw what happened that day. That's the point. I don't deserve to wear the badge if I can't carry it the right way. I let myself believe I was better than the people I swore to protect. That ends now." Marcus let the words settle before responding. "And what comes next?" Ryan exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet. But I'm not done trying to fix this. I've started volunteering at community programs, trying to rebuild trust instead of tearing it down. It's not enough, but it's a start." Marcus nodded slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Starting is the hardest part. The rest depends on whether you keep showing up." Ryan stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I'll keep showing up. That's a promise." Marcus didn't offer forgiveness, but he extended his hand, and Ryan took it. The handshake wasn't warm, but it was firm, a silent acknowledgement that the first steps toward change had been taken. Ryan turned and walked away, his steps more purposeful than Marcus had ever seen. As Marcus stood there, the sound of footsteps approached again. This time, it was the chief. He stopped beside Marcus, both men looking out over the water in silence before the chief finally spoke. "Caldwell's resignation will be official by the end of the week. There's still fallout to deal with, but we're making changes, starting with training programs and community outreach." Marcus's voice was steady. "It's overdue." The chief nodded. "It is. But it's happening now." Marcus turned to face him, his eyes sharp. "Make sure it doesn't stop when the cameras do." The chief met his gaze, his voice firm. "It won't." As the chief walked away, Marcus stayed behind, letting the sound of the waves fill the quiet. He thought about the faces that had watched him that day in the park, the ones who had recorded, shouted, or stood silently by. He thought about the questions that still lingered, about justice, accountability, and the weight of forgiveness. Marcus knew his story wasn't just his own. It was a reflection of something bigger, something that stretched far beyond one moment, one mistake, or one apology. It was about the battles people fought every day, not just against others but within themselves. Battles for respect, for equality, for a chance to be seen and heard without judgment. He turned back toward the city, the skyline sharp against the fading light, and he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Not because the fight was over but because it wasn't. It was still being fought, one conversation, one step, one choice at a time. And now, as he walked away from the water, Marcus knew that every step he took wasn't just his own. It carried the weight of everyone who had ever been made to feel small, unseen, or unworthy. He carried their stories with him, knowing that the fight wasn't about winning, it was about showing up, again and again, until change became impossible to ignore. This story isn't just about Marcus. It's about all of us. It's about how easy it is to judge, to assume, to act out of fear instead of understanding. It's about what happens when power is abused and trust is broken, but it's also about what can happen when we choose to face those failures instead of running from them. So what about you? What would you have done in Marcus's place? Would you have found the strength to stand tall, to demand accountability, to resist the urge to let anger consume you? Or would you have given in to the weight of the moment? And what about Ryan? Do you believe people like him can change, or is forgiveness something that has to be earned, not asked for? We want to hear your thoughts. What does justice look like to you? What does accountability mean in situations like this? Share your opinions in the comments below and let's keep this conversation going. And if you found this story thought-provoking, emotional, or impactful, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with others who need to hear it. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next story.